Scene/Chapter 10. Contact with the Energized Chi Field. Get the vibe. The connection. When Bob wakes, the monks are all there and have not gone out to collect alms as is their usual routine, but are chanting long and loud, so he joins them. After they have been chanting for some time, the lead monk sits on a raised block and tells them all it's the day that they can no longer tell anybody what they learn. What comes next is more than what appears to be the controlled exercise they have learned so far to control the chi field within themselves, but to tune into the external chi energy field. The monk says that it is important to realize that the knowledge they will be given now is sensitive in some parts of the world, and they must be careful they don't get into trouble for what they know or get pointed at first like they have to have licenses for martial arts in some places. The knowledge is to be kept between themselves, as the knowledge has had an unsettling history and anybody who talks will basically get themselves into trouble. They set out long tables of food and the lead monk speaks as they eat, which is strange as they eat in silence. He tells them that now they are to learn about the chi field or chachong. It refers to the cultivation of an energy field by person or a group, typically for healing or other benevolent purposes. A chi field is believed to be produced by visualization and affirmation, and is an important component of the wisdom healing Qigong or Zen and Qigong, founded by Grandmaster Ming Pang. This field then becomes part of each individual who tunes to it. Although the term Qigong, Qigong, has been traced back to Taoist, or Taoist depending on who is spelling it, literature of the early Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, about the same time as Muhammad, and with the writings of over 1,000 years earlier by the sage Lozi on which it is based appearing in the Zhou dynasty, 600 BCE, just before the time of the sages Confucius and the Buddha. The studies of similar energy fields go back into prehistory, the prehistoric times of 2700 BCE, and Fuzhai, which have writings going back to the Kangji system of writing Chinese characters circa 12,000 BCE. The Kangji system predates the Western philosophies, which are based on Sumerian scripts of 3000 BCE, which were heavily modified by the traveling salesmen merchants of the time, always ready to tell a tale to sell the goods and trinkets. Circa 7000 BCE. The important discoveries of the Jiu archaeological site include the Jiu symbols, one of the world's earliest examples in the history of writing, carved into tortoise shells and bones, the 33 Jiu flutes carved from the wing bones of cranes, believed to be among the oldest playable musical instruments in the world, and evidence of wine fermented from rice, honey and hawthorn leaves, the certain signs of organized intelligent life, an extension of the pot age that had evolved from the Stone Age circa 20,000 BCE in the Far East. In this context of philosophers of practical wisdom, we must consider Confucius, circa 500 BCE, and the later Tang dynasty, 600 CE, version, a copy of prehistoric systems as we see Islam's Muhammad, 600 CE, to be a copy of Judaism's Moses, 300 BCE, via the Catholic Christian Jesus, 0 CE. The term Qigong, depending on speller, that is currently used was promoted in the late 1940s through the 1950s to refer to a broad range of Chinese self-cultivation exercises based on the philosophy of practical wisdom. It emphasized practical health and scientific approaches, while emphasizing spiritual practices, mysticism, and elite lineages. However, traditionally, Qigong training has been esoteric, secluded and secretive, with knowledge passed from adept master to student in lineages that maintain their own unique interpretations and methods in exclusive and reclusive monasteries. The lineage aspect was inherent in the early Confucian social importance of state or people's community that the society paid for, to provide servants, guards and other social services. A few, shall we call them leaders or indeed analogues of Plato's philosopher kings, were also selected to take on the challenge of education, learning and knowledge through a lineage of intelligence. A similar lineage system, although now dropped in many fascist communities and replaced by those who are guilty of theft from society to call themselves celebrity rich, is still in practice in France with the so-called énarques, from the École Nationale d'Administration, ENA. The énarques come from the top of the French grandes écoles, who tend to be fiercely clever and answer questions with the phrase "there are 3 points," and make other systems look like pathetic attempts to play schoolyard protection rackets and lollipop cartels to extract break-time pocket money. The lineage behavior is also practiced in some other communities as Ivy League or old-school-time Masonic fraternities, mainly based on the USA financial class system, with lower classes unable to pay for tuition. This form of selfish greed-based aristocracy arose which dulled the intelligence through overbreeding and uncontrolled eugenics, with some calling them the Illuminati, who appear as a secret society who now try to integrate by saying, pathetically, they are a society with secrets. Those who have contact with the Chi Field know what they say is a bunch of lies and a greed-based collective like the Bilderberg Group and the Davos set, who see the world as being filled with their captive slaves who are encouraged to be chained to be in debt with them and who have stolen far too much from the global society. The idea is that the brightest kids in the class can go on to run the country. However, it doesn't work, as the diverse pool of knowledge required by the concept became restricted by greed of financial control to an even smaller select few. Those in this so-called elite, their word, comes from much the same upper-middle class background, and they are not running the nations well. They then spew out of national politics into international institutions of monetary funds and United Nations-type establishments influencing the global policy with the policies they supported that failed in their own nations. Even their micro-policies which worked not being appropriate in a macro-global situation. The policies to support local zone self-sufficiency and accountability are concepts far removed from their doctrine of the capitalist accumulation by force, and so their growth paradigm ensues until it loses agility and rots in a stagnant heap, as we have seen in many Western nations, and hidden by those frightened to admit it and lose their position of financial wealth. They may be smart and swats and get grammar and maths, but they don't have experience or, necessarily, ability to see the big picture, mostly suffering from the well-known situation that if you are no good at something, or sitting inside a closed box, you lack the very skills you need to know you are no good at it. This self-imposed lack of necessary skills means that the conceited illusory superiority of career-liar politicians and their corporate pals and economists, followers and supporters, voters, don't have the skills to know they are being destructive to economy, ecology, evolution and the planet. Most of these individuals come from narrow-minded small groups and enforce their narrow-mindedness with their conservative doctrine that they cannot challenge or change without destroying the very doctrine they follow. Following doctrine denies the self-analyzing ability of scientific thought to make change. A big mind is needed to take in the big picture. The standard failure of Adam Smith's capitalist theory that the baker would keep the business wheels in motion by letting his profits trickle back into the community by his purchases, did not take into account the baker's greed and self-interest to keep hoarding the profit for himself. What happened? That media advertising that his wealth, by theft, from the community business cycle made him a rich celebrity, perpetuating the business leaders to doing more of the same and so crippling the cycle-driven market as the grease to lubricate the business has been removed. Printing more money to replace this loss by theft from society and hoarding then devalued everything around them, and then the society falling into the debt decline that destroyed the limited resources of global economy. We have seen the growth paradigm has failed as resources have reached their saturation plateau. Consumerism is now failing due to loss in population increase. We know the investment to gain from unearned income is failing. Even the headless chickens who follow the software-led markets are trapped by bubbles that are near bursting, as devaluation, or majority lifestyle destruction to create class equality descent only works once or twice and not forever. A new paradigm of cyclical sustainability needs professorial support, and it will only be sustained if the so-called celebrity rich have their stolen wares put back into the wheels of social community business and make the estuarial retentive trickle down into a gush of catheterized incontinence into deserving goods, productive areas of primary basic need of food infrastructure supported by shelter, transport and communication in order to support it. This direction sustains life with good food and with all involved in that. Then equality of getting a healthy full contented belly is not creating a life of misery as the current system provides. The lineage system was also a policy of the European monks in their reclusive blinkered religious enclaves as a comparative alternative. Monastic knowledge groups were responsible for early writing, herbal remedies and wine-making etc., and who documented it all, but who rejected worldly holistic knowledge and remained inside their self-made box to the detriment of those who followed them. The Qigong has remained a personally transferred person-to-person process, with physical activities made strict and adhered to down to the finest detail in order to avoid natural variations caused by word-of-mouth communication turbulence. However, the monks who learn the arts are then sent from the monasteries out of the box to go far and wide to impart their knowledge into the community and learn more from the community. The early chosen few that were given the responsibilities in these societies had the knowledge to administer policies and law, and mainly chastised those who stole from society or who misrepresented the law for their own benefit. This still is very much the way the Far East is administered within a few areas, prefecture districts. This is a continued, but now maybe over-controlled, strict and slow-changing learning path, with a few people all making the same decision due to their training being exactly the same without any alteration. They follow a strict set of standardized working practices, directives, recommendations, guidelines, policies and procedures that are created centrally but administered locally. The ability to modify the standards is limited in applying them to ecologically differing zones between inland agricultural, inland water or sea-bound and city environments. The non-transitive zones being far removed from transitional neighboring differences. The local administrative cogs are maintained to be well sharpened, and so their behavior can be predicted, so the central core only needs to be able to collect statistics, provide advice and do the firefighting of instability caused by natural disasters. It is interesting to note that the now thriving German nation has a similar operation with self-responsible local sovereign zones or Bundesländer under the umbrella of the Central National Unit. A local neo-sovereign administration is ecologically focused and far from the kind of central committee leadership which is based on vague out-of-date paperwork that not all on the central committee fully understand, find relevant or representative to their position with a centric policy. There being a futile waste in trying to comply, amalgamate and unite with the necessary local policies, most which often conflict due to ecological differences with the northern icy tundra and mountain forest, tropical sea mangrove swamp and desert areas being prime examples of large ecological differences. The central administration or constitution is written in a language that is often no longer fully descriptive or appropriate and is steeped in rigid stagnant antiquity of at least centuries. The old texts are propped up with deep piles of mitigating amendments instead of regular complete concise progressive rewrites without the addition of piles of redundant amendments to be relevant to current conditions. After all, Plato wrote his texts based on society that was small in the millions rather than the billions, thousands of times more than he considered in his time. Even the USA was in millions when it was formed, and now it is in hundreds of millions. 2 orders of magnitude greater than when its constitution was written. This exemplifies the kind of administration that becomes so obese, flabby and slothful that a decision is practically impossible to find and becomes inherently useless, stagnant and ineffectual at finding solutions for anything to promote the social prosperity for the community. This is the kind of thing that has happened to the UK and USA and the now failed Central European experiment, who continue to try and rule by antiquated techniques from the time of Plato that were developed for small communities and that are unable to perform in now hugely overpopulated areas. The population of China is that of the USA and Europe combined and works in a much more efficient manner and has done for eons at least 12,000 years of written history before the Middle East began its corrupt civilizations that have gone west. An information system that is blinded by a flabby obese pile of unstructured information without any form of classification or grouping, collating and profiling, is not a progressive system unless that information is partitioned with strict concise metadata and search algorithms to use it. The information itself is not as important as those with the ability to search and analyze it, and those who do this are the owners of the cosmological data crown. The age of information has become the age of searching that information. Unfortunately, those search algorithms can be used to exclude results as well as provide open information access. The method of increasing documentation to the point of it being unwieldy is very open to corruption, and as a community grows much greater than was ever intended, the size of data grows with it, and so the corruption grows. It becomes a farcical heap, and the way the early papal regimes decayed due to uncontrolled administrative obesity, which allowed unilateral groups performing inquisitions in the name of the core central system, which eventually lost feeling in its tentacles and tendrils the longer they became and as they multiplied. It is like an octopus or squid with more than the 8 tentacles it is intended to use, and those tentacles have grown in quantity and to double the length, like the tendrils of a banyan tree that declare unilateral independence without the central trunk being aware. This result, with the ends no longer being in touch with the central system, results in us saying that the suckers on the ends are not represented at the central office, and chaos reigns as corruption can enter the communication paths with ease. As Losey said, the more that laws and regulations are given prominence, the more thieves and robbers there will be. This was an early insight that their rule of law is a dystopic direction, and those who support it are either stupid or looking for control to support their own selfish plans and position. In the authoritarian left and right political views of Stalin, Mao Zedong left, and the Pinochet, Thatcher, Reagan, Bush, Napoleonic aristocratic patrician and religious right-wing fascism through the centrist authoritarian Nazi, we can see the awful results in history that they have produced. Imposed laws create dystopic societies, whereas the Gandhi ashram community of self-responsible accountability do not create disparity and conflict, but however attract the jealous behavior of assassins and bandits. It is important to teach personal accountability and internal ethics, of causing no harm to others, and undemanding respect for all things. In that way the common sense laws and respectful rights are embedded in the people without the necessity for a futile, socially sapping, inefficient group of agitating military and legal groups to impose laws. Those who do not or will not learn soon become outcasts and shunned by the community. This can be seen in village and township communities, but as community rises to city sizes, the non-productive situation breeds laggards and child-minded members wishing to be parented and easily led by the pleasure principle, and while being falling the lowest common denominator of irresponsible members of society, they never wish to grow up, eventually supporting each other in their infantile, jejune, juvenility in order to looked after by the productive rural communities who are unrewarded and underpaid for their efforts. Unfortunately, the degradation of rural folk causes them to flock to the bright lights of land, in consequence where they then struggle to stand on each other's throats to become top of a heap which has no room at the top. This causes them to slowly ebb away their independence and self-worth, replacing it with some unhealthy fantasy position far removed from human self-realization. Although the practice of Qigong was prohibited during the Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong in the 1960s, it was once again allowed after 1976, and disparate approaches were merged and popularized, with emphasis shifted away from traditional philosophy, spiritual attainment, and folklore, and increasingly moved towards health benefits, traditional medicine and martial arts applications, and the development of a scientific perspective. However, not many years later, another crackdown and persecution, in 1999, of the spiritual practice of Falun Gong, a Qigong discipline also known as Falun Dafa, that is a form of spiritual Qigong practice that involves meditation, energy exercises, and a moral philosophy drawing on Buddhist tradition. The practice of Qigong in China has been restricted. However, over the same period, interest in it has spread, with millions of practitioners worldwide. The Communist Party instigated its withdrawal under what they called the rule of law, a phrase often bandied about which is meaningless as the so-called law is split to restrict and control the wider population, with freedom being specific to a few and blatantly biased towards higher cadres. This is not using social law to be beneficial to the wider community. The campaign was driven by large-scale propaganda through television, newspaper, radio and the Internet. There are reports of systematic torture, illegal imprisonment, organ harvesting and abusive psychiatric measures in draconian education through forced labor camps, with the apparent aim of forcing practitioners to recant their belief in Falun Gong. The monk goes on to say that in 2006, allegations emerged that a large number of Falun Gong practitioners had been killed to supply China's organ transplant industry. This horrifying organ collecting process and the movement of execution sites with medical units to execution sites being attached to hospitals was first unearthed circa 1992, but the press reports, in which the Western reporters were escorted from China by the authorities, did not grab world attention at that time. An initial investigation found that their source of 41,500 transplants for the 6-year period 2000 to 2005 is unexplained, and concluded that there has been and continues today to be large-scale organ seizures from unwilling Falun Gong practitioners. Ethan Gutman estimates 65,000 Falun Gong practitioners were killed for their organs from 2000 to 2008. The knowledge gained in human mutilation of conscious prisoners in Chinese labor camps is similar to the Nazis' experiments on the Jews in their labor camps. There are some stories of those who have access to this information and are using it for genetic experiments. Bob raises his eyebrows as the monk talks about this, knowing not to ask about it but to remember to look it up later, as he knew the journalists who first uncovered the organ replacement story that started with the higher cadre Chinese military life-extending surgery, which then was prolific in Hong Kong, with Western clients going into China, getting fast-track replacement procedures of organs but mainly corneas, and returning within the day to be surgically reconstructed in Hong Kong before they died or went blind. The monk sees him flinch, appears as if to read his mind, and emphasizes this is why it is important to keep your knowledge to yourself and those who have it. You will soon know who else has it when they are near to you in the next levels of the teachings. He mentions that the spread of Qigong has been so great that unscrupulous people tried to cash in and make money from it by making ridiculous claims to weak Western minds easily fooled by fashion in order to sell their ersatz variants of the art. They were of course charlatans, but their behavior caused restrictions on its use worldwide as a cult following, and since the Chinese clampdown, the rise in popularity did not increase until recent years, when an underground vibration has been felt globally by those in tune with it, and it is a dark form influencing the use of the Qi energy. As he says this, he stares helpfully at Bob, as Bob looks like he is making connections to his recent experiences. The monk goes on, pointing to a chart of Qi lines at the teaching area away from the tables, the areas they have studied in the early part of the teachings. He says Qi also appears in other forms of ancient philosophy around the planet, where it is explained as humors and other life forces that appeared in ancient philosophies that became religions. This happened in the rising days in the European areas, when these practitioners had no conclusive way of knowing what they were talking about. They invented something around the existing venous flows and included bloodletting as a cure by removing the ailment, which often killed the patient permanently. The early studies of Qi did not resort to creating some fantasy dogma, but studied the analysis of practical issues that they observed. We now know Qi is a combination of blood-venous system, lymphatic system and nervous systems, but their integrated interaction is necessary for all to perform in a Qi manner. Remove or disrupt one of them and the creature becomes unwell or dies, so they are obviously important connected systems. The mind when dead has no effect on the rest of the body, even if it can be stimulated electrically to show the paths still exist. This has been proven by analyzing accident victims who have lost part of their brains and through the experimental and reported private use of hallucinogenic substances that remove the personal connectivity from the body, known as the identity crisis during level 5 or above hallucinations. Hallucinations show further and further dependence on the pattern matching process, with it becoming more apparent as the hallucinogenic level rises and the senses are bypassed by pre-stored patterns instead of reading the environment without the hallucinogen. The internally stored patterns gained through experience showing their process by increasing effect of them superimposing themselves on normal physiological responses, being most noticeable with the moving edges which appear in the visual cortex. The patterns appearing as dedicated partial images that then combine across edges. These effects are similar to the patterns that appear during meditation or the entoptic phosphons that appear when one is in a completely light-free space. Those who say they are visualizing anything with their eyes closed are only providing a dialogue which cannot be argued against or tested, and so is not falsifiable. It cannot be tested or challenged to be true or false, and so of no real practical interest. A pipe dream, of an individual, or mass hallucination or mass hysteria of a group, with each member of the group bolstering and enforcing each other's hysteria and not wishing to say anything against it or be marked as not being part of it. Nobody wishing to say the king has no clothes in case of destroying the illusory fun. One sees images of these patterns during dreaming, but during consciousness the signals from the eyes override them unless controlled by hallucinogens or deep meditation with highly raised alpha and beta wave patterns which appear just before and after sleep and can be raised by a state of meditation or deep relaxation. The cognitive pattern matching appears with experience rather than the often pre-knowledge which is based on basic alarm through the basic senses, like amoeba move away from dangerous environments, of abnormal chemical, temperature, vibration, noise, but with one cell don't have the power to think about a fight or flight scenario, but still are programmed to some extent to know what is good and what is bad, but that if it is extreme change move away or raise an alarm by crying out. However, before the identity crisis the energy of the individual knowing it exists and providing an inner dialogue to itself remains intact. Cut off an arm and the brain can still feel the fingers or leg toes even though those systems connections been removed. Recent investigations show that those signals can be used to activate machinery, and of course direct connection to the brain has similar abilities. So, we observe the mind as a strong key point of reference for initializing the flow of chi, and that blockages in chi pathways have to be removed. A clear path is one that is easy to travel, but a path without bumps and lumps does not bring innovation, as variations are required in order to progress. However, nature provides the lumps and bumps in its cycles, and the clearance and smoothing process is in itself very important to discover what they are. We see the chi energy as a wind that blows free. We find that those with uncomplicated minds, children, possess huge chi energy, and, as one gets older, the ability to remove complications created by learning and experience from the mind becomes more difficult. The 1960s showed the path of the shaman, which rose at an incredible rate with the use of hallucinogenics to bypass long periods of meditation training, but it was crushed by governments not wanting their subjugate population to become enlightened and to keep them under the neo-slave control which preserved a few neo-aristocratic patrician parasites sucking from the many. These parasites providing promotional propaganda from controlled media outlets for what they saw as a material wealth, gaining more greed-based celebrity than education with mind-expanding analytical wisdom. What has appeared since then is a dumbing down of population in order for the parasites to keep the workers under tranquilized mind-numbing retarded moronic ignorance dominated by conservative more of the same false security which falls into social stagnation. The failure of blanket enforced stability based on false premise, as we see has swamped some parts of the planet. The ancient Chinese had notions of the chi force actually existing at different levels, the highest flowing out and around, and is the area we come to next in our learning, the power of mind and the chi field. It appears to have been a hereditary ability, is some kind of extrasensory perception that some call the ability of visionaries. Some people attain it without knowing it, and we have now found it is available to all of us who have progressed beyond the animal sensory stage. We find we all have the chi energy, but some of us have it to a much greater extent and are able to know what others are thinking and are able to implant their thoughts in others. It is all a matter of conditioning to be in tune and project into it or out of it and be able to filter what could be a cacophony of turbulent chaotic signals. Chi is a didactic concept in many Chinese, Korean and Japanese martial arts. The teachings of the martial art form of Qigong is a feature of both internal and external training systems in China and other East Asian cultures. The most notable of the Qi-focused internal force, or Jin, are in the martial arts of Baguaz Hang, Xing Yi Quan, Tai Chi Chuan, Snake Kung Fu, Southern Dragon Kung Fu, Aikido, Aikijujutsu, Liu and Quan, and Liu He Ba Fa. Demonstrations of chi or Qi energy are popular in some martial arts, and they may include the immovable body, the unraisable body, the unbendable arm, and other feats of power. Some of these feats can alternatively be explained using biomechanics and physics, and many are shift of weights that divert the force energy of the opponent. For example, a main process of Aikido is to use the opponent's energy against them by waiting for them to attack and lose their position of stable strength. Some have also perfected a method of martial art which is used in debate to drag an opponent into a discussion and wrong-foot them and defeat their argument by letting them expose themselves and their weakness. As Lozi said, those who know do not say. Those who say do not know. This is the way of making those who do not know talk and show they do not know and expose their ignorance. Although like the powerlifting of weights that the human body cannot endure but are displayed in the non-Eastern arena side shows which if not perfected cause bodily injury of breakages and dislocations, the special demonstrations of Qi and Gin are also unable to be explained by just pure biometric physics but of power of the mind over the body. The current research shows that there has been a great increase in the global Qi force. Luckily it is not like anything to do with Star Wars, but, however, it can be used in a sinister way. It may just be a result of increased population, but it appears the changes we are experiencing globally now are more focused towards a fraternal bias. During the old times, Qigong training had been cultivated by small secretive groups, as I mentioned before, with knowledge imparted to those selected by their individual ability and passed from adept master to the select genetic group in a strict lineage to maintain their special abilities. Not so much to develop a master race like some oppressive authoritarian religious marriage eugenics or Nazi inbreeding acts of Aryan eugenic horror, but as a group who could master itself, body and mind combined as its prime directive, as they did not wish to master anyone else. A very similar mindset to the monasteries of Europe, which started as centers of reclusive though but who were eventually led astray by politically motivated religions. He emphasizes that the first farmers started this kind of genetic modification to produce various strains and breeds of plants and animals for food and clothing, simply by picking the most productive and hardy examples and breeding those. Genetic modification by thoughtful selection, unlike natural selection by the win-lose survival of chance positioning. Now the breeds of pets is the greatest GMO display of all, highlighted to its ugliest extent at the Crufts Dog Show. So, genetic modification even of humans is not new, but it has used naturally evolved selective breeding techniques most prolific in religious eugenics based on no intercultural marriage and pushed to extreme by the Nazis with their attempted production of the Aryan master race, which was in fact a breed to compete with their observation of Jewish eugenic domination of working sectors, and that grew out of the Indian caste system. However, He says, like in Star Wars, the dark side existed in the minds of some who wished to harness this incredible power. So, we have been testing you over the past days without you realizing it, and we find you are made of the stuff that can look after the knowledge. Those who have left the group needing more focus to move onwards. He laughs. The vomiting and purging in our initiation cleansing process is a sure way to determine if you are committed or not, isn't it? And the process cleanses more than your body. It is the priority to start clean, and our addict repair centers start that way, but they do not continue the way we are going to spend the next days, as the minds of addicts need many years of help in having to throw away their reliance on external chemical crutches. He ends his lecture with saying that now they have the history and the warnings, and that is sufficient to be aware of what they are doing and to begin the last stage, which grows forever. They all stand, bow, weigh and clear up the tables. As they work and chat, Bob remembers past gambling speculation of his boss and his strong selfish conceited sense of self, and his inherent selfishness being detrimental to the newsroom he controls. Bob accepts being in touch with self does not mean being selfish. The finding of oneself to be only important to that person's position in the universe. A position which we now know we can only interact and after all only see 4% of it, the rest being dark energy and matter which does not interact with us but works on a cosmological scale. However, even that little bit we see appears huge to us and makes us look small and insignificant on a cosmological scale. They agree finding oneself inherently finds all others who have found themselves with many others still drifting. They go on to discuss philosophy with another monk, sharing the discussion with other monks speaking about the subjects that they study. The group goes on to discuss and get closer to each other's thoughts that as part of finding oneself, self-realization, it is also important not to take from others without their consent, to steal from them. The process has been a long search, exemplified by stories of the recent prophets like Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, etc., who focus on an unprovable deity in comparison to the earlier sages Laozi, Confucius and Buddha, who were philosophical sages of experienced practical wisdom, which was picked up by Socrates, circa 500 BCE, no doubt, though the stories picked up along the Silk Road or its predecessor. Trading routes that appeared between the Sumerian civilization in the Indus Valley some 5000 BCE, that appeared over 7,000 years after the early Kangji system of Chinese writing of Fuxi circa 12,000 BCE, through southern India and the Levant through the Middle East to North Africa, where it moved north into the European zone, where it finally crossed the Atlantic to the Americas. All of these sages predated the Middle East religions of oppression and punishment, who took the stories of the sages and transformed them for material gain for themselves by selling spiritual bliss in return for giving away wealth to them for a false spiritual position when they die, guilt money. Even if they existed or not, someone has experienced what has made up the similar structured stories, even if it was advertised by a traveling salesman or merchant using it to sell his mother's homemade snake oil, balm, spices, carpets or sandals. Basically, the breakdown between the first sages and the social domination paradigm of the prophets who followed is like this. The prophet studies the future and points out the opportunities for righteousness and goodness that we may encounter in our life's journey based on unprovable mythological tales which emphasize punishment and the reward being no punishment. Hardly motivating. Tales which make no argument, doctrinal statements, and, as argument with doctrine destroys the very doctrine on which it is based, they only allow enforcement of those doctrines, dismissing any other analysis. The sage looks into the past and shows us how we made way for our healing presence and power in the choices we made and the paths we followed. The sage emphasizes the ethical way of doing no harm to others and the benefits that brings. The prophet deflects, delays and deludes us with the lethargy of romanticized hope of unrealistic, unattainable wants and wishes, of there being places for everyone at the top of the mountain or hierarchical heap, dealing with or describing anything or everything in an idealized or unrealistic fashion, for example a perfect heaven. The stories of the prophets often make something or things seem better or more appealing than they really are, and also weakening any proactive drive we may have, as it will be given if you are good with a load of predefined actions and restrictions defining what is good. Some of these are for the social good, but most are ludicrous patterns of behavior of ritual and worship. They usually promote being good at doing nothing and not rocking their lethargic conservative boat. Of course, the promises are never given, unless someone does it for you. You could indeed wait a lifetime, as many do, leading lives of unproductive hope. It is the few who don't follow their fantasy and do it themselves actually succeed. The sage, however, strengthens us with the gift of meaning and a proactive purpose, showing us the paths that have led to success and social prosperity. There is a difference between the philosopher and the sage in that a philosopher is a wise man distinguished for wisdom and sound judgment, while a sage is a wise man distinguished for wisdom gained from experience, his own and that of others that have walked before him or her. Philosophy is concerned with fundamental problems regarding existence, values, mind, language, etc., by a critical, systematic approach that relies on logical argument and reason. Academic philosophy, on the other hand, is distinguished from the activity of philosophizing by a preset group of technical terms and pre-existing concepts, curriculum, and methodology that take years of study to internalize and end up with blinkered vision. None of those of the past which are main subjects of student curriculum cater for overexpanded populations which have in the past been culled by war. The old concepts had some validity, but it does not in the first half-century of the 2000 millennium due to the unrestricted overgrowth of the transnational corporate slave breeding of consumers to feed an unsustainable population growth, as resources are not available to feed them. New philosophical systems come and go, and, as a rule, the most easily impressionable people who take any of them too seriously, and as a matter of fact, run into the dangers of growing up as pungent and intolerant followers of another man's intellectual fantasies. This can also be applied to extremist followers of religion. The philosophical approach to thinking ideally leads to system building. The creators of the most memorable Western philosophical systems, Immanuel Kant's enlightenment that one ought to think and reason autonomously, free of the dictates of external authority, David Hume's radical philosophical empiricism, Georg W. F. Hegel's absolute idealism overcoming dualisms and the rights of laws, Karl Marx and his socialist Marxism, for example, are remembered as great philosophers. Yet, of these great philosophers' great philosophical systems, all purely intellectual inventions or representations, no doubt, none seemed to have passed the test of time. Kant's free thought is nullified by corporate slavery, with universities being destroyed as roots of academia and being replaced by business studies universities. Kant was anti-utilitarian, noting that those theories are driven by the merely contingent inclination in humans for pleasure and happiness, not by the universal moral law dictated by reason. To act in pursuit of happiness is arbitrary and subjective, and is no more moral than acting on the basis of greed, or selfishness. All three emanate from subjective, non-rational grounds. The danger of utilitarianism lies in its embracing of baser instincts, while rejecting the indispensable role of reason and freedom in our actions. Economics is now based on the pleasure utility which has no empirical form, is arbitrary and subjective, and so its variability is a consequent scam to put numbers to a pseudo-science which has now crippled the Western economies, and debt and derivatives which now have lost the collateral worth on which they were originally based. Human radical philosophical empiricism or rational sovereign states has fallen into a world of grab-by empire builders of inefficient monopolies, forging leaderless political amalgams with no guiding policy, winging it on a conservative stagnant wind of decay. Hume also believed in an unequal distribution of property, because perfect equality would destroy the ideas of thrift and industry. Perfect equality would thus lead to impoverishment, and now we see mass gross inequality, selfish hoarding, thrift curtailing, reinvestment and industrial sabotage of resources has in fact resulted in rampant mass starvation, with over 20,000 dying of hunger every day. Hegel postulated absolute idealism overcoming dualisms and the rights of laws. His claims that this focus on the right of personality, while significant in distinguishing persons from mere things, is abstract and without content, a simple relation of the will to itself. The imperative of right is, be a person and respect others as persons. A major maxim of ethical behavior. In this formal conception of right, there is no question of particular interests, advantages, motives or intentions, but only the mere idea of the possibility of choosing based on the having of permission, as long as one does not infringe on the right of other persons. Because of the possibilities of infringement, the positive form of commands in this sphere are prohibitions. The concept of personal rights for the majority has been dissolved by inequality of financial status, by government promoting celebrity theft from society, the hoarding of wealth to appear so-called rich. This is achieved by a few patricians in the background, while there is a smoke screen of the waving of false flags on racial, religious and sexual inequality. While the smoke screen thickens, more financial rights are removed from the wallets of the populace, while they have fear induced in them by newsreel propaganda of the collapse of already corpsed communities in the Middle East and large areas either side and south of it. Marx's socialist classless Marxism recognized that progress through struggle is energy inefficient and creates disorder would fail. However, classlessness eventually failed as the enforced equality fell into impoverishment, as Hume posited, but by tyrannical mismanagement in communist Stalinist Russia and Maoist China, with overly strict oppression not allowing personal customization of lifestyle. With the Iron Curtain eventually being rusted away by capitalist sabotage sponsoring its oligarch-dominated society. At least the ex-communist states' populations have some understanding of the politics of social awareness and social conscience, which is vacant in the West, with voters who follow the Western mother's antisocial apron strings. The Western philosophies all have failed for various reasons. The Western philosophy of love of wisdom now falling to least common denominator of love of material economic growth, this being quite different to the Eastern philosophies that it seems were picked up by the classical Greek philosophies. Many Eastern schools of thought were more interested in explaining the natural world via universal patterns, without recourse to capricious agencies like gods, or God. Syncretism allowed various schools of thought such as Yin-Yang, Wuxing and Ren to mutually complement one another without threatening traditional religious practice or new religious movements. Nobody has come up with an overpopulated society philosophical group version that the Western philosophy has created, other than to create war to cull the population of its bright young men. War leaves a society of easily led, naturally conservative women and children, leading to societies which rely on the government parenting the community and leading it by using the child mind pleasure principle with offers of bright shiny objects. In this way the community never grows up into having behavior associated with a reality principle. The Eastern philosophy has dealt with massive populations much greater than all the Western nations combined, and years of war-torn torment that they have overcome for tens of thousands of years before the West came onto the global scene some 2,000 years ago and started its greed-driven warring ways without learning from what went before. A sage can perform philosophy, being a person who practices the philosophy of practical wisdom, but not every philosopher is a sage. A sage practices sagehood, which is linked to self-cultivation and the striving for balance, harmoniousness, and human perfection. A sage's thinking is concerned with the relationship of himself with other human beings, and the relationship of human beings with the greater order of all things. It begins with a universal understanding. Our perception and imagination are figments of reality. This is the cosmos existing with us as a very small part of it, not reality being a figment of our imagination, as reality can be tested externally by different individuals or testing mechanisms remote from human influence. The universe rewards us for observing and understanding it, and we can get an alert if we do not. If we jump off a cliff without understanding it, our reward is not pleasant. When we understand the universe, we acquire a spiritual or inner equilibrium and feel at home. Romanticism does not do this. Their Zen koans, Hindus and Buddhist parables help in making people's lives and thoughts conform to reality and make effective balanced people from them. In contrast to them there are the Judaism, Christianity, Islam, JCI, based on Taoism and Confucianism dogmas. These represent the unrealistic heaven and hell, their fates, and ancient wisdom as guides to current human thought and action without modification to suit evolved changes in conditions. The fundamental question comes down to: are you balanced in a practical down-to-earth existence, or are you guided by the belief of an unreality created by someone else? It is as we say, up to you, but you would not be here if you did not want to find out and pull the experience for yourselves and find the sage growing within you as you practice practical methods rather than just blindly accept the propaganda thrown at you by television and other push media. The recent self-finding activity rose to a healthy height in the 1960s before it was crushed and sabotaged by conservative capitalist greed, pushing people into being corporate slaves with a military, paid-to-follow-orders attitude. It has now been driven underground, with all forms of legal high being made illegal except for banging oneself over the head with a brick or perhaps a French loaf to stimulate the inner brain effects with what are known as closed-eye visualizations, CEV. These appear at different levels. Level 1 is visual noise, Level 2 is light, dark flashes, Level 3 is patterns, motion, and color, Level 4 is objects and things, and Level 5 is overriding physical perception, also as phosphons, or the phenomenon characterized by the experience of seeing light without light actually entering the eye. Above Level 5, the effects of loss of identity or the identity crisis make recall of the effects difficult to describe or analyze afterwards, other than meeting the aliens, due to the intensity of the crossover effects of mental stimulation between the normal brain pathways that don't usually interact. The phosphons can be directly induced by mechanical, electrical, or magnetic stimulation of the retina or visual cortex, by accident or through experimentation, the bang on the head, seeing stars, etc., as well as by random firing of cells in the visual system through infection or some degenerative disease like diabetes. Phosphons have also been reported by those in meditation that is commonly called nimitta or dhyana, series of cultivated states of mind, which lead to a state of perfect equanimity and awareness called upekkhi sati parijudal. People also experience these effects who go for long periods without visual stimulation, also known as the prisoner's cinema, or by those who are using psychedelic drugs. The group agree is best not to speculate but to find conclusive results on which to base decisions. Bob recalls again that his boss is guilty of speculation and has a overabundant sense of self to exude conceited selfishness to the point of keep saying he loves himself, which makes Bob cringe. After the tables and cutlery are eventually put away, they all assemble in smaller groups and, later, after more exercise and the daily Tai Chi routines, the group is sitting in the open-walled temple and are all facing inwards while the lead monk starts chanting a new form of chant. This continues all day and into the evening, with some of the students rolling over in their sitting position and collapsing from lack of food and water. As they chant through sundown and into the evening, something begins to appear around them, like some small ghostly sparkles that zip past them, seemingly looking as if they are inspecting the group by zipping in and around their heads. Bob smiles and thinks, oh no, this is just like strange encounters. This continues for some time as the group chants and look around in astonishment, until the lead monk stands up and says, now I think we should all go and sleep. One monk stays and points into the air with a look of wanting to keep the visions going, and the leader sternly says, "Sleep." They all go to their beds without talking. The next day they all have had intense dreams and look at each other in ways as if they have all been in the same dream. The lead monk gives a brief talk while they eat a very small amount before they move to sit in smaller groups. He says it is tradition teaching of the Far East in that of opposites, the yin and yang, that though in modern science we find that the ultimate balance that was assumed in the past does not exist completely when thermodynamics is considered, with what can be considered leftovers of disorder or entropy as a third part. Just like the boundary conditions of Newton's work, which states to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Here on Earth many equal and opposite reactions are sufficient to explain everyday life, even though his statement does not encompass the quantum or galactic scales. We are unable to personally experience the observations modeled by Einstein, quantum physics and string theory, as we don't personally have either the high mass or smallness and the velocity, but by secondary observations we know of their existence even if they don't affect us in our daily lives. However, we do experience the works of Newton within the enclosure of our global boundary conditions on an everyday basis, as he drops a book on the floor and pushes it with his foot and says every action has an equal and opposite reaction. We see what my foot does, but we did not see the world move up to it or feel the world and the book warm up when the book hit it, but we can see the loss in potential energy of the book and move from an ordered high to a disordered low, with disordered sound reaching our ears but also wafting between and past us into infinity. Even though the book may look as if it falling down, it has given it some order to be closer to the planet. It has in fact lost the ordered position it had before, but sometimes this is a good thing. When a tree grows it appears it is creating order, but in fact it creates more disorder in the environment around it. The same analog can be made with a worn house, a city which creates disorder in the resources it uses to be built. Life being a continued manufacturer of disorder as living entities grow and disorder the resources from which they are made. The ancient teachings of opposites of contraction being in balance with expansion and the mastery of stillness being a mastery of lighting speed are within us. Similarly, in the ways of this Far Eastern perspective, to attain the strongest belief possible is to have no belief at all. As we know, actions speak louder than words. This also compares with silence being louder. The balance brought about by Chi is to gain social prosperity by progressive balance against natural chaos, not to try and control chaos but to move with it, with nature. It is necessary for our evolution to attain communal survival for all rather than for the non-adaptive survival of a few overly fit mutants in preference to a majority who cannot possibly have those abilities. Unfortunately, the West reveres and promotes humans as celebrities who are different to the point that they cannot be competed against by the average person, either by sports agility or overpaid brainless B-rated porn stars. This is accompanied by the promotion of an inequality paradigm for those who fall into the greed towards absurdly named luxury goods or rubbish with a brand name, most of which do not reflect quality and bring down the name of quality brands. While one group is promoting inequality by the unequal genetic differences in sporting physique, body shape, fashion, shall we call it, beauty, and in celebrity, acting, music, financial class, etc., mostly based on genetic luck with a bit of added effort, with abilities that are not available in the general public in any way that they may be able to ever compete, there is another making laws to enforce equality of complete sameness of sex, race, religion, etc., so removing diversity by enforcing monoculturalism and highlighting differences and showing favoritism to minorities rather than dispensing with favoritism. Favoritism is the worst kind of discrimination and is a method of manipulated social eugenics, creating a societal GMO. It is natural multicultural adaptation that needs to be encouraged, as has happened in the Eurasian arena, where Europeans have joined and integrated into the Far East without sufficiently altering the instinctive base ethnic culture that we see in the rural areas. However, cities are country and geographical zone independent and create a vile form of greedy, self-obsessed, dependent, weakling GMO creature that has no natural antibodies caused by drinking bottled water and plastic-wrapped irradiated food. A group that is found in an overcrowded arena with all of them trying to grab a single ball from an imaginary hand. Unfortunately, governments attach themselves to cities and grow within them, ending up with these city-minded creatures attempting to enforce selfish grabby, hierarchical city penthouse values on whole nations. In the worst case, transnational corporations impose this on the whole planet with government backing through corporate sponsorship of the politicians who are not in the true sense political policy makers but subversive inside job social manipulators. It appears from outside as if it is totally counterproductive, unhinged, out of control and futile. And if one looks beyond the superficial glitzy thin veneer, it is. There are exceptions of a few with community abilities, spokesmen, entertainers, true statesmen, etc. who share common abilities. However, there are many examples of what the average person cannot be. Those who are generally selfish mutants who promote their unattainable directions, and for the average person they create misery and unhappiness for those who do not have the ability to attain the falsely elevated position they hold. This state of inequality is advertised and promoted by those who are socially counterproductive and socially destructive, sabotaging the very essence of community spirit by their overuse of self-absorbed pampering and elevated addictive obsessions. The kind of individuals who include those who have been opportunistic and who have stolen too much from society and who eventually brings social demise. They are easily to pick out by their outrageous excessive lifestyles, throwing shit in the face of the average person from their personally hoarded gaudy penthouse, mansions, fast cars, yachts, and at worst gross personal collections of many of all of them. Not one person needs all those toys or outrageous possessions that are lauded and heavily promoted by the mainstream media. There is no harm in difference. It is the extremes to which they are taken that either causes problems or, as we will find, bring enlightenment. The key is choosing which ones to learn that are good or are detrimental to well-being. Those who believe in struggle or inequity as a method of attainment by screening success or failure create disharmony and imbalance by their social sabotage that results in social demise. The purveyors of social sabotage trash those who fail rather than repurpose their efforts as a community learning experience towards shared prosperity rather than the glorification of greed-based celebrity. Those who promote community in favor of selfishness create social prosperity and harmony but become targets for the greedy to dispel them so they may win their material foolery. What we find is concentration of our internal state expands our external state. After their philosophical discussion, the group cleans up, relaxes in meditation, and then perform chi routines together, and then they sit in further meditation and repeat the same chanting procedure all day with little to eat. This time by late in the afternoon a few students have rolled over and been removed and put into slower progressing groups in outbuildings, but by late afternoon Bob's group is in deep meditation and there appears singular orbs around the heads of those in the group. As soon as this phenomenon begins around them and the evening closes around them, they are again told to go and sleep by the main monk who is continually providing guidance for them. The next day they are all sitting and eating a small breakfast and saying they don't feel that they have been sleeping. Bob is impressed by all the monks' global awareness of philosophy, society and science, particularly in how he has grouped global events into a big social picture. Much of the discussion he had covered during his time at university, and it all came back to him. Bob accepts that as the guardians of society the monks would appreciate social issues in great depth, and that in recent times are fully aware of developments in universities and global affairs at top professorial level. After a brief talk going over and reviewing what has been said in the past few days, they all sit motionless in the temple. This time, after a short time of chanting in stillness, the chi energy orbs appear around their heads and they experience their orbs merging like amoeba with other students until the whole group forms a dome over them filled with objects, shapes, faces and intermittent bright sparkles. Bob smiles as he sees planets and stars circling and reminds him of the alien spaceship control room in the movie Prometheus. The old lead monk sits still with a big, contented smile on his face as the events progress, acknowledging that they are evolving and adapting to their new enlightenment. Another day passes and one monk says, "I am starting to see things everywhere." Bob says yes, it is like some hallucination. Another says we have not eaten for many days. Another says it must be like the experience the Buddha saw when he dropped out. They turn to find the lead monk quietly behind them, who smiles wise and walks through them saying, "Now you are feeling it." As they assemble and sit in the group again, the dome forms and faces of friends and family appear, and then the dome reaches out like some many-armed mythical creature, like tendrils out and over the trees, and ethereal dancers like will-o'-the-wisps with many arms appear in the center of the dome. One monk then says, "I can see inside my family." Another says, "It's true, I can see inside you." Bob sees his girlfriends. They are okay, but among lots of other women all wearing identical Morzedong Great Leap Forward type nondescript Red Army clinical blue uniforms with big buttons, of the We Are One Jelly Mold Dead Dork Brigade. However, the girls both hold out their arms and smile lovingly at him and blow kisses. Bob pinches himself as he does not believe they are there, but they remain. He rolls onto his back and up again with a big smile on his face. He has found them. The lead monk explains that they have reached a level of enlightenment that now found and made contact with will now increase within them. He alerts them that it is necessary to be able to keep it under control, as they will not need the strict methods they have been using in the training sessions that they have been going through anymore in order to tune into it again. He reminds that they have also have to tune out from it, or their heads will be continually filled with noise from the thoughts of everyone around them. Although the contact mainly manifests itself on concentration on one person, the chi energy is a grid system which passes between all individuals. They all go to their beds and sleep to awake with a massive breakfast being prepared by temple workers with many tables. The main monk quips this is enough to feed an elephant party, as he points to the annual elephant party of many elephants eating from tables. As they sit, they find they are unable to feed themselves much before their appetite is filled. They have all lost quite a bit of weight and look gaunt. One says to another without looking, "Yes, I am full too." They then stare at each other and laugh in shock that they have communicated without sight or sound. The main monk talks to them again, telling them that now they have experienced the enlightenment, they don't have to believe in chi or be good at letting your chi believe in you as long as you realize it's there. It has evolved with all living things, including the planets, some of all the energy that is often called Gaia by some. He says some call it God, but it goes beyond that concept, as it is not the limited merchant God created by the West, as Chi was always there and observed thousands of years before. When we die we lose contact, so it is necessary to pass it on to those who show themselves to be worthy while we live. Some individuals never touch it even though we are all born with it. They are filled with mental blockages from birth by their community. Most atheists are brimming with it, as they have not blocked it out by some other oppressive belief system. This is what makes the Orient special, why China decided to stay at home and burn its boats in 1444 rather than conquer the world it had already investigated and decided the greatness was within themselves. The monk eventually says, "Thank you for your dedication. We are now all connected with an important energy and we must use it well." He stands, bows and walks off into the trees while the group disperses to their beds for personal meditation. The next day those who are not monks disperse, some stay a few days to experience some more meditation, and a few like Bob return to their homes. After exchanging hugs with his newly enlightened friends, Bob slowly descends the hill on his own, feeling more in tune with the sounds of the trees and the birds, and gets on his bike and drives slowly down the road, slowing and driving in a circle and stopping once to look back at the hill before returning to the city suburbs.